Hi there, welcome back. Sorry the last video cut off so abruptly. I didn't notice, but for some reason my phone doesn't like to do videos for more than around 30 minutes. And here we go anyway. This was the chapter that it cut out on the theory of motion of fluids. Measurement of water which flows through tubes and pipes, through rectilinear and vertical orifices, vertical and circular, through orifices under pressure, through communication and motion of fluids when at rest, shock of water against plane surfaces. Many different things that we probably don't even consider nowadays, because we've changed the way of our technology and thinking. Hydraulic canes, machine and violin, centrifugal force machine, Archimedean screw, suction pump, force and pumps, suction and force and pumps, double piston pumps, chain pumps, ship pumps, fire engines, engines for raising water, pistons and valves, hydraulic machines, goes on. Supply towns with water, self-cleaning filters, cost of raising water, laying down mains, height that jet of water will rise. Atmosphere is a moving power. Yeah, pumps, post windmills, power windmills, self-adjusting cap, and the relative effects of windmill sails, comparison effects of mechanical agents as blowers and ventilators. Windmill and lighting, and grates, stoves, hot water, and so on. Sliding hydraulic valves, pressure indicator, quicksilver valves. Steam engine, steam considered as a moving power. Steam engine, atmosphere, engine, single acting engines, double acting boilers, materials for making piston gauge, the dynamometer, the water gauge, glass gauge, feed net apparatus, safety valves. Goes on. Timber and its properties, I knew quite a lot as well. And this was written in the middle of the 1800s about the history of civil engineering, so it's going on back into about 1,000 years before Jesus, before Yeshua. And it does have references in it as well, which is quite awesome. Which leads me to wonder as well, where is all the information nowadays that he was referring to in this book? But you'll see what I mean when we get to some of the things. But the kind of bridges that they were doing, timber ones, you know, these timber bridges back then, bays and arches, floors and parapets, swing bridges, single and double turning bridges, drawbridges, rolling bridges, rope bridges, bridges of boats, floating bridges, centres of various kinds for bridges, tunnels, strength of, how determined, scaffolding, suspended scaffolds, turned scaffolds, various kinds of knots used. Masonry, they go into loads as well. Groined arches, groined vaults on an irregular and on a hexagonal plan, hexagonal ground vaults, groined vaults, the pointed ribs, circular vaults, groined ribs, Gothic vaults with ribs uniting the keys at the centre, hanging keys, Gothic vaults formed from inverted parabolic conoids, arras vaults, concealed vaults, trumpets, spherical domes, vaults in a square plan, hemispherical niches, spheroidal vaults, conoidal vaults, pendatives, groined vault over the circular plan, construction of staircases. So, you know, nothing that we see today is new. It's all been done for a very long time. Stone bridges, waterways, you know, loads of stuff. Construction of fashionies, bucket work for jetties, river and sea walls, dock and wharf walls, canals, you know, cutting canals, draining and banking, construction of machinery, railroads, principles of proportion. These are the kind of designs that you see in some of this magnificent architecture, that they're trying to mimic nature and God's pattern. And they've done it for all the different types of architecture, the 4 or 5 different types that will be brought up in this book. But they just have different, through each age, each type of architecture, they have different principles that they follow. Maybe different understandings at them time, as you know, we've become more devolved from what we used to be. But, you know, the architecture, Dorian's tetrastyle porticos, hexastyle porticos, octastyle temples, Doric columns, Ionic proportions, Ionic tribes, Pantheon at Rome, triumphal arches, something proportions, Roman examples, Byzantine, Romanesque, Lombardic, Saxon, Norman, Saracenic and pointed architecture, proportion of mass and void in cathedrals, tracery and geometric forms on mouldings and windows and groin vaults, their thrust and relative dimensions of piers, sections of cathedrals and so on. Excuse me. So this book is really fascinating, and some of the things it goes into is some of the earliest times. Phoenician engineering being some of the first engineering we have. But somewhere that I saw in the book, not too far in, it refers to giants helping us construct some of these things. And, you know, I've not seen anything that refers to that before until now, which quite interests me, and it also explains how a lot of the things could have been built that have no explanation, like the older star forts where they are complete. I'm currently also reading John Stryce's Perilous Voyage at the moment as well, and that goes on about the amount of forts and castles and that everywhere, and it also goes on about how people in them times in the 1630s or 40s were actually constructing their forts as well, and it was going on about how certain forts are added upon in times of prosperity, others are added upon in times of war, apprehension of war, and there's different reasons for different ones, but the ones before the flood, I believe, were used with sound and light as their energy, and that they were towns that worked for themselves for good and for its inhabitants, and then after that the forts were used for purposes such as war and protection, and that's why the more recently constructed ones tend to have more so just walls around it that are no longer a part of the snowflake, I suppose, but still look like it, but just are clearly there just for fortification and not for the purpose of sound anymore, or for goodness of inhabitants other than protection of them. Anyway, here we go with this book. As commerce and the art of war equally require the assistance of the engineer, employment may be dated from the time when history notices the one and relates the success which attended the other. War, in the early ages of the world, being considered more honourable than the arts of peace, traffic and handicraft trades, would be but little esteemed, and so few good workmen were then to be met with, that we read of such a hero as Ulysses being obligated to construct his own boat, as well as to decorate the furniture as his rude palace contained. As the knowledge of navigation improved and traffic became more general along the shores of the Mediterranean Sea, the inhabitants found that the high precipitous cliffs, broken into headlands, and the numerous intended islands, by the assistance of art, might be made to afford better protection to their vessels against the sudden storms to which that sea is subject. To the architect, whose studies comprised all the sciences which had been developed by society, and united in his employment what was then known of construction, the lifting of heavy weights and arrangement of machinery was confined in adaptation and improvement of nature's works. Their defence from aggression of every kind, the formation of the city, the roads, the supply of water, that was deemed necessary or essential for the wants and pleasures of the inhabitants. To the Phoenicians, who so long enjoyed the dominion of the Mediterranean Sea, we must give credit, the first encouraging the art of the civil engineering. They are among the earliest descendants of Noah that settled on the coasts, and who made navigation subservient to commerce. These people, named Canaanites, which in the Eastern language signifies merchants, first inhabited a city called Sidon, in consequence of its being built by the eldest son of Canaan, whose name is Bor. The country around not being fruitful, the inhabitants were obliged to turn their attention to manufactures and commerce, and use every means to induce other nations to trade with them and take off their surplus productions in exchange for necessaries of life. In the days of Patriarch Abraham, the settlers had become more powerful people, that when Jacob blesses his children, he tells Zebulon that he shall dwell in the haven of the sea, and he shall be for a haven of ships, and his border shall be unto Sidon. The Phoenicians lost the greater part of Canaan, which they held in the time of Joshua, when the land as far as Sidon was given to the tribe of Asher. The inhabitants were not, however, destroyed, but suffered to extend their commerce and to send out colonies to the shores of Africa and Europe. Cyprus, Rhodes, Greece, Sicily, Sardinia, Gaul, and Spain received settlers from the Sardinians, who taught the native inhabitants the first rudiments of science. 1250 years before Christ, we find the enterprising merchants passing through the Straits of Gibraltar, found the port of Cadiz, where they laid upon the extensive warehouses the produce they freighted from the parts of the then known world. Gold, silver, copper, lead, tin, and iron they supplied in abundance, and these metals were obtained either by exchange with natives or by work with mines which they discovered. This was 1250 years before Christ. Apparently, 3,200 years ago they were dealing with these metals. Sanchoniathon, who was supposed to be a contemporary of Joshua, has left us many traditions of Phoenicians. Sidon is at present town considerable importance, known as Said or Said. This ancient port is nearly choked up with sand. Houses which rise from it and contain upwards of 15,000 inhabitants are built along the shore, and in part as the traveller approaches. The idea of a plain of some extent considerable employment is still given to the spinners of cotton and manufacturers of leather, and at a short distance from this shore is the island of Said, once connected by a mole with the mainland and forming a second well-sheltered harbour. The Roman bay is commanded by a modern battery. Behind this Turkish fortress are traces of the ancient city and the remains of several tombs. However, the 15th book of Odyssey mentioned in this city, and in describing the arrival of one of the ships, tells us how it was freighted and that it contained toys and fancies of every sort. The same poet often alludes to the works of art, the mantles of various hue, the dyes, the silver goblets, the heads of amber riveted on gold, other articles of luxury that were sent to Sidon, and the fair Sidonians were highly accomplished and embroidered in other ornamental works. Sidon was rendered important from the mercantile disposition of its inhabitants, who were also skilled in producing all kinds of manufactures then in demand. The mountains of Libanus, in their field afforded them abundance of timber for shipbuilding, with which there was constructed vessels that carried their surplus produce to the most distant lands. Hadfarsardine, the emir of the Druses, who dreaded the constant visits of the Turkish fleet, not demolished the ancient mole, we might have had it in our power to describe the structure of the Golden Age, or of the time when the giants are said to have given their aid. For vast indeed in dimensions are many of the stones that lie scattered along the coast, and which once formed the mole that shut in their harbours. Some of these stones are reported to be long enough to have extended through the whole thickness of the mole. At present, ledge of rock affords only shelter to vessels which frequent this port. This is a short distance of the coast, and stretches itself in front of the citadel towards the north. Its ancient port is for a long period enjoyed and sovereignty of the entire Mediterranean. That its surrounding country was barren, and the inhabitants could not have subsisted without commerce, which brought in the trade and the arts. Some of the early bronze and silver medals bear proof how highly they were advanced, and history attests to the success which attended their navigation. Homer, according to Strabo, speaks only of Sidon when he alludes to the inhabitants of Phoenicia. Tyre, or Sor, called the daughter of Sidon, stood also in the sea at a distance of about 200 stadia southward. We must be careful not to confound the three different cities which had this name. The first in order was the old Tyre, on the continent, then Tyre on the island, and Tyre on the peninsula. After the island was joined to the mainland, it had two harbours, one lying north and the other south, or towards Egypt, which were formed by the isthmus. The latter was close harbour, and the opening through which ships entered was fortified by drawing a chain across it. An artificial mole still defends this bay, and probably the rocks on the other side were once built upon thoroughly to enclose it. Northward at the head of the island stretches out from a ruined lighthouse another mole, which protected the northern harbour, since uniting the island of Gully has been formed as if the sea had again broken through, and once more separated from the continent. Tyre on the island and Tyre on the mainland for a long time constituted one city. According to Pliny, the island was 700 paces from the continent, but according to Strabo, 30 stadia, or nearly 3 of our miles. The same author states that the walls which encompassed it was 150 feet in height, proportionally broad, and built of large massive blocks of stone, embedded in mortar. Modern travellers place the island at about a third of a mile distance from the shore. The old Tyre was first destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar after a siege of 13 years. The inhabitants having removed all their treasures to the island, the conqueror was therefore obliged to rest satisfied with destroying the town on the mainland, after which he set out towards Egypt. Tyrians were then compelled to submit to the rule of the Babylonians, and for 70 years were governed by kings of their nomination. The Persians then restored to them their independence, whom they assisted when Xerxes carried out his wars against the Greeks. And Herodotus informs us that the kings of both Tyre and Sidon formed part of the Persian monarch's council of war. 332 years before Christ, these cities were destroyed by Alexander, who, in his march towards Egypt, compelled the cities of Phoenicia to submit to him. Tyre obstinately refused him entrance, when he immediately commenced a memorable siege, which ended by his taking the city by force of arms. The height of the walls, the strength of the navy, and the abundance of all the defence made it difficult, an almost hopeless attempt. He began, says Diodorus, by demolishing old Tyre, and employed his army to carry away the stones and raise the mole 200 feet in breadth, which was speedily advanced. Whilst this was doing, the Tyrians determined to send their wives, children, and old men to Carthage, and keep their young men to defend their walls. But this was not carried into execution. The walls were covered and new invented engines, and especially on that side where the mole was in progress. When the mole was carried within a short distance and the cast of a dart, a large whale was thrown upon it, much to the alarm of all parties. The citizens, being struck with the increase of the mole, sailed out in small boats, accompanied by slingers, archers, and armed engines of all kinds to discharge of arrows and darts. A violent storm of wind arose and destroyed a portion of the work, and broke through the mole, which was speedily repaired by causing large trees cut down in the mountains to be thrown in with the branches entire, on which was heaped a quantity of earth to render it strong enough to resist the violence of the sea. When the mole was complete and within a short distance of the walls, Alexander commenced battering them down, discharging at the same time darts and arrows of engines at the besieged. This was a couple of thousand years ago. The Tyrians, to guard against these missiles, had contrived wheels with long spokes of their battlements, which, turning constantly, shivered all the darts that came in contact into atoms. Is that like a helicopter propeller? It's trying to say. And just sliced them up. And they checked the violence of the stones thrown by the ballista, by wall packs placed in proper situations to receive them. The Tyrians did not relax in their exertions. They built within their outer wall another 10 cubits broad and 5 cubits distance from the former, and filled the space between the earth and stones. Alexander then constructed a battery by joining many of the ships together and then placing rams against a portion of the wall, beat down 100 feet of it, and then attempted to pass through the breach, but was repulsed by the Tyrians, who, during the night again, rebuilt the wall which had been battered down. The Macedonians, who then approached the towers as high as they approached with towers as high as battlements of the Tyrian walls, and casting out planks formed a bridge. Here they were again repulsed by the Tyrians, who had contrived long tridents or three-forked hooks to grapple the woundees placed on the top of the towers. These grapples, attached to ropes, they flung over the shields of assailants and tore them out of their hands. Nets were thrown over those who attempted to pass the bridges and formed of planks, and they became entangled that many of them tumbled headlong to the ground. They also filled their iron and brazen shields with sand, and after they had made scorching hot by placing them over fires, by the means of a machine cast upon the besiegers, and getting between their breastplates and coats of mail, burnt their flesh, and many died in consequence. The Tyrians sent off fire darts, heavy stones, and all kinds of missiles, and with long poles, armed sharp knives, hooks, they cut the cords of the battering rams in pieces. They also discharged out of their machines masses of red-hot iron. They plucked men off ramparts with iron instruments shaped like a man's hand. Alexander was undismayed and unwearied in his exertions. He continued to batter the walls and discharge ponderous stones out to his engines, and all sorts of missiles from his wooden towers. Marble wheels placed on the walls and kept constantly turned where he made throw of them to render them ineffectual. Hides and skins were also sewn together, which, being soft and pliant, were placed in other situations for the same purpose. At last, Alexander, perceiving that the wall next the arsenal was weaker than the rest, he brought all his galleys which contained his best engines chained fast together to that place. He cast a plank from a wooden tower, and with one end to the battlements of the walls, thus forming a bridge, and alone mounted the rampart, and to the astonishment of all, neither regarding the danger nor the assaults of the Tyrians, his Macedonians quickly followed. He came first in contact with the enemy, and killing some with spear, others with sword, and tumbling others down with the boss of his shield, he overcame his adversaries. During this time, the battering rams had made another breach in the wall, and the Macedonians entering, joined the party fighting with Alexander, and gave him means at the last was taken the city. Last was the city taken. You have to bear with me, it's still early in the morning, I'm still half asleep. The Tyrians, throughout the siege, made the most valiant defence, but instead of bravery, awakening into the breast of the conqueror an admiration for their courage to his last disgrace, he ordered 2,000 of chief inhabitants to be crucified, and sold 30,000 for slaves. 8,000 of his chief soldiers perished in the combat, and the city itself he burnt to the ground. Nearly 20 years afterwards, again, we find Tyre able to resist an attack made upon it by its fleets of armies of Antigonus, who, after 15 months of siege, captured it. It subsequently fell under the dominion of the Roman Empire, and the Latins were not finally driven from Syria until the century after the death of Saladin. In the year 1188, Conrad of Montserrat was hailed as the prince and champion of Tyre, which was then besieged by conqueror of Jerusalem. The Egyptian fleet was allowed to enter the ancient harbour. A chain was immediately drawn across the entrance from mole to mole, and 1,000 Turks were slain. Saladin was obliged to burn all of his engines and to make a disgraceful retreat from Damascus. Afterwards, Tyre was a place of rendezvous for ships of Genoa, Pisa and Venice, and eventually it became part of the Turkish dominions. The insula, Tyre destroyed by Alexander, is now a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea. As Ezekiel prophesied, the mole which the conqueror raised was washed away by a storm, and thus the peninsular state of Tyre was destroyed. Aridus was also a city belonging to the Phoenicians, and another called Tripoli, which was built by the inhabitants of Aridus and Tyre, and thence its name. The settlers of very early period excelled in the sciences and brought the arts manufacturers to great perfection. They were the inventors of astronomy, and from them the Greeks received their letters. The glass, the purple dye, fine linen produced here was celebrated all over then the known world. They were skilled in the working of metals and carving of timber, and were so perfect in the arts of construction that we hear of them in the time of Hiram, being employed by King Solomon in the construction of his temple more than 1,000 years before our era. As merchants, they had commerce of the world. As navigators, they were the most experienced, and the greatest discoveries, as well as planters of colonies, and for many ages they had no competitors. They carried considerable trade in Syria, and having convenient harbours, excellent timber furnished them, and built them great numbers of ships. Carthage, according to Velleius, was founded 65 years before Rome, while many writers imagine that it was built 130 years before the imperial city by Dido, the sister of Pygmalion, king of Tyre, and wife of Sychaeus, and the Tyrians he carried with her to colonize this new settlement were among the most skillful in the arts of then known world. In the form of government she introduced by the Aristotle said by the most perfect of existence. Carthage was situated at the extremity of a gulf upon a peninsula 360 stadia or 45 miles in circumference, and the isthmus which united this peninsula into the continent of Africa was 25 stadia and more than 3 miles in breadth. On the west projected a long strip of land, half a stadia in breadth, which separated the sea from a lake which was strongly protected by rocks on both sides. In the middle of the heavy city was Acropolis, called Barasa, where was a temple, Aesculapius. On the south side of the city was a triple wall, 30 cubits in height, and at every 480 feet was placed a tower, which had its foundations laid at the depth of 30 feet, and was 4 stories in height, being carried up 2 stories higher than the walls. There were 2 harbours so disposed that they were communicated with each other, although they had but one common entrance, which was 70 feet in breadth, secured by chains. One was devoted to merchant ships on the inner port, as well as the island called Kothon in the midst of it, which was surrounded by spacious quays and was made secure for the reception of 220 ships of war. Magazines, storehouses, and all the requisites of an extensive arsenal were constructed around it, and the entrances to the harbours were decorated with marble porticos, so that the whole might be said to be encompassed by 2 magnificent galleries. Upon the island was the residence of both governor facing the mouth of the harbour, so that he could see all was passing both within and without the port. When the merchant ships entered, it was not possible for them to view what the inner port contained, but it was shut in by a double wall, and each port had its particular gate. It's fascinating, really fascinating stuff. They were doing this thousands of years ago. The city had 3 divisions, Bursa, Megara and Kothon. Israel was 3 miles in circumference and stood nearly at the centre of Carthage, surrounded by Megara, which contained the houses of the citizens. These, at the time of the Third Punic War, were numbered in 700,000. Livy gives 23 miles for the measure of its circumference, and Suardus affirms that it was the most powerful city in the world. It enjoyed the dominion of the sea for more than 600 years, and it had extensive lucrative commerce. The you know what I mean, possessed 300 cities in Africa. Wow. And their territory extended from the western confines of Cyrenaica to the Pillars of Hercules, a distance upwards of 1,500 miles. Spain, Sicily, and all the islands of the Mediterranean also belonged to them. The Carthaginians, who disputed the empire of the world with the Romans for 118 years, were destroyed as a nation, and 146 years before Christ, Emilianus, the Roman general, made 2 attacks, one against Bisra and the other against Kothon, and having come master of a wall which surrounded the port, threw a considerable force into the great square of the city, soon after which Asdrubal abandoned the Carthaginian troops and went over to the city, soon after which someone else abandoned the Carthaginian troops and went to the Romans. His wife could not survive such perfidy and committed herself, children and followers to the flames, which then enveloped the citadel and temple. Soon after, the victorious Romans demolished Carthage, as well as the cities dependent upon it, and the territory was declared a Roman province. Excuse me. The enormous wealth that had been amassed by the commercial people is stated by Pliny at the upwards of £4,470,000 weight of silver, which was carried out and away by the Emilianus. Carthage is now a considerable distance from the sea. Northwest wind at the Megiddo have closed up an ancient harbour. The place is called El Mersa, and the port lies to the north and west of the city, and forms the Lake of Tunis, the peninsula which Carthage was built. Upon the other side, Carthage has been a loser by the encroachment of the sea considerable tract. Land was being now under water. Traces of Kothon, though scarcely 100 yards square, may be seen. Sorry, forgive my bad reading. Along the shore was the openings of the common sewers remain, and also at short distance great reservoirs and aqueduct near the western wall of the city. There are more than 20 of these western cisterns, each 100 feet in length and 30 in breadth, and the water was conveyed to them through earthen pipes still visible. So my video is probably going to cut out any second now, so I'll end it here anyway, and the next video we'll do on chapter 2. Forgive me for my poor reading, and I hope you enjoyed the information that's here, and I hope you are looking forward to the rest that's going to come out as well. Thanks for listening. God bless.